Chiaki was trying to figure out whether Kamakura-kun would enjoy Deseigia, Hour of Darkness, or the ported Dungeon Explorer more when he appeared, almost out of nowhere, and handed her a thick stack of papers.
"What are these?"
she asked, taking them carefully. "You requested pictures of your friends." That was right, she had. It had been earlier this week, and he'd said he didn't have any. She thought he'd forgotten about it. How he came by these, she didn't know, but she didn't doubt his ability to get things done. Chiaki looked through the paraphernalia slowly, heart clenching. A photograph from Miyoda-san and Sayonji-san's latest dual performance, a newspaper article about Kuzuryu-kun and Pekuyama-san's latest raid on the Future Foundation, a magazine covering Monokuma-themed food by Hanamura-kun, and other various clippings. It hurt to look at the proof of what her friends were doing, and it was probably wrong of her to hope that the Future Foundation didn't catch them. After all, they were terrorists and criminals now. But she didn't care. They'd been her first friends, them and Hinata-kun. They meant so much to her. She wanted them to be safe and free, even if it meant they could continue doing atrocities.
I guess I'm selfish that way.
The pink-haired girl swallowed and placed them aside.
Thank you.
She could feel his eyes boring into the side of her head. You have not asked me to find your parents. A question disguised as a statement.
Oh.
Chiaki shrugged, mind involuntarily flashing back to her dream earlier.
They weren't really around when I was growing up, so I don't really feel much for them. I mean, I don't want them to be dead or anything, but it's a bit hard to be concerned when I feel like I barely know them. Yukizomi-sensei was more a mother to me than my actual mother.
Part of her felt a bit guilty for thinking that way, but she couldn't help it. Yukizomi-sensei had been everything she imagined a mother to be, even though Chiaki knew she was only a few years older than them. Kind and encouraging, yet firm when she had to. Interested in her students' well-beings and hobbies, and always willing to offer advice. Chiaki had admired her, tried to base her behavior as class rep off her. She'd been her role model. So why was it that, when she recently thought about Yukizome-sensei, she felt a sense of betrayal? She knew Yukizome-sensei had been brainwashed with the rest of her class, but that didn't explain the way her heart pinched when she thought of her teacher and not her classmates. Thinking of her maternal figure and absent biological parents brought a question to her attention, and she turned to the raven-haired man.
What about your parents, Kamakura-kun? Are they doing all right?
I do not have any memory of them. I do not know whether they are alive or dead, and I do not care enough to find out.
They didn't visit you during the project?
Hadn't he been underage at the time, actually? Didn't that mean his parents would have had to consent to their son being used as the guinea pig of the Kamakura project? Chiaki sorely wished she could forget that question as soon as it occurred to her. Her parents had been neglectful, but she was fairly certain they wouldn't have agreed to anything of that nature. They did not. After my creation, all non-essential personnel were prohibited from visiting. Before does not matter, though from what I have gathered they were not diligent in visiting Hinata then either. Chiaki had to swallow the lump in her throat at the thought of poor Hinata-kun sitting in a lab somewhere, alone, knowing his parents couldn't even be bothered to check on him. Then Kamakura-kun sitting in that same lab, bored out of his mind and locked away from society like some prized animal. She knew that feeling of being ignored by the people who were supposed to love you, and she hated it. She also knew he didn't care. And maybe that was what made her saddest of all. He genuinely did not care about how short the stick he and Hinata-kun had drawn was.
I guess that's something we have in common,
she mumbled sadly, when it became clear that he was done. Dungeon Explorer was looking the better option. Co-op would probably be ridiculously easy for them, but having only 2 players instead of 5 might make up for that. And she was a fan of the classics. He took the controller wordlessly, and she inserted the disc. Then she settled down next to him and prepared to play. Nanami was a most illogical girl. That was the conclusion Izuru had drawn from his interactions with her. He'd already suspected it somewhat when he saw her attempting to help him while bleeding to death, but more time with her confirmed it. She was prone to acts of faith and emotion, acts which had very little basis in reality. And there were her constant attempts to beat him at video games so he could have fun. It was impossible for him, he'd told her multiple times, but she persisted. Granted, he did feel less bored when with her, which was the closest he could ever get to having fun. So there may be something there, but then again, it was only because he was with her. Playing the games by himself made them go right back to being dull. Currently, he was overseeing the end of another therapy session. They had actually gone over schedule a little. He'd suggested stopping a few minutes ago, but she was determined to continue. She felt that she could reach across 2 rooms this time, and after a moment, Izuru had calculated that she was likely to manage it within the next 3 tries, so he allowed it. Just as he'd predicted, on her second try, her legs held out until her hands were pressed against the furthest wall. Then her knees buckled, but she managed to turn her fall into an ungraceful slide to the floor. She seemed far too happy to notice, eyes sparkling.
I did it!
Nanami exclaimed as he approached. She looked up at him and beamed at him.
Kamukura-kun, did you see that? I walked all the way to the wall.
That you did, he agreed listlessly. He could never look at her smile for too long. It caused fluctuations in his heartbeat, each and every time, without fail. He'd quickly figured out it was a byproduct of his attraction to her, but somehow it failed to prepare him for the next time. He took her upper arm and pulled her up. It felt so thin, he noted, not for the first time. His hand closed almost all the way around the fleshy upper part, his forefinger brushing his thumb. And she always felt so small when he carried her. Sometimes it made him concerned she was malnourished, but whenever he checked, her weight was within healthy parameters for her height and age. She was just short. He wasn't certain why he was always taking mental note of things like that. Why should her frame, or hair color, or eyes capture his attention? Multiple times at that. They never changed from the last time he looked, but they were always intriguing to him. But then, the fact she could prompt consistent emotional reactions from him, without them growing dull, was one of the reasons he found her interesting. As he half carried her back to her wheelchair, Nanami's gaze drifted to the calendar on the living room wall. Her smile faded, and her pink eyes grew melancholy. Izuru ran some quick mental calculations, and soon realized why. Today is the day she almost perished. He was not surprised by his failure to recall that before now. Some distant part of him had noted September's arrival, but he never tended to pay much attention to dates. They held no significant import to him when each day was as meaningless as the next. It seemed unreal somehow that a year had already passed since he'd first fought to save her life.
Thank you, Kamukura-kun.
Her words were soft and sudden, but he heard them nonetheless. It was obvious what she was thanking him for. Given the date, it had to have been saving her life. But he would entertain her. He blinked at her, gesturing for her to elaborate. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear.
I mean, you looked after me for a year. For you, it was probably boring to spend most of that long time with an unconscious person.
It had been.
But you did it anyway. And you've continued to help me and watch over me since. And I just realized I never said it before now, so sincerely, thank you.
She was grateful to him. She trusted him. Izuru let her wait in the silence as he mulled this over. It was not new information, but it was still something he couldn't quite comprehend. It was just foolish of her. She didn't remember the full extent of his past association with Enoshima, but given how intricate his knowledge of the model was, she must at least suspect it. Your thanks are misplaced. I am not a good person, Nanami, he finally stated. I do not care for the world, and I have plans that are not necessarily ethical ones. His plan to upload Enoshima's AI into the Neo World program to test whether despair was stronger than hope, for example, was something Nanami would definitely not approve of. Nanami winced at his bluntness.
I know,
She said after a pause.
I mean, with all your talent, you could probably have stopped Enoshima before things escalated this far. You probably had plenty of opportunity. But that doesn't mean I can't be grateful for what you've done for me. It doesn't mean I can't be grateful for getting to meet you. I know you aren't a good person, but I don't think you're a bad one either.
Izuru noted there was a warm feeling in his chest. This was not the first time he'd experienced such a thing, and he'd already ruled out environmental and health reasons as its cause. No, it was a reaction that solely occurred in her proximity, often at random moments. He should have tired of such a predictable thing, and yet he had not. An irrational belief. You do not have sufficient evidence to support that hypothesis. Her smile returned, and his heart did those inane palpitations again.
I told you before, didn't I? I just feel it in my heart. That's good enough for me.
A most illogical girl indeed. End of Chapter 7. Author's note.
Aw, look whose POV came back! We'll be seeing through his eyes a few more times, not often, but I at least wanted to establish how Izuru felt about Chiaki now that he's actually interacting with her. My headcanon backstory for Chiaki has always been that she was a rich kid with neglectful parents who were always out on business trips and stuff. I feel that best explains how she could constantly afford new video games, her initial loneliness and isolation from her peers, and how she kind of latches on to Chisa as a maternal figure. At least she's better off than Hajime. His parents really did fully consent to the Kamakura project. There's text, Japanese but still, saying so when Chisa's reading up on it in episode 6. No wonder the poor boy has issues. His parents essentially said they wanted to trade him out for a more talented son.